It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Margot Vance laughed as she poured the vintage Bordeaux over Sienna Vance's dress in front of the 100 guests. The dark liquid bloomed across the cream linen like a spreading bruise, cold and sticky against Sienna's skin. A collective gasp rippled through the manicured gardens of the Vance estate, followed by a silence so heavy it drowned out the nearby string quartet. Margot didn't flinch. She tilted the crystal decanter further, making sure the last dregs dripped onto Sienna's sensible flats. "Oh, I am sorry," she said, her voice dripping with a mock sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "I thought you were one of the servers. You really should try wearing something that doesn't scream charity bin at a Vance anniversary party." Sienna stood perfectly still. She didn't scream, didn't cry, and didn't rush to wipe the stain. She simply looked at her cousin. The scent of expensive lilies and jasmine from the floral arrangements felt suffocating now, mixed with the sharp, fermented aroma of the wine. Across the lawn, Julian and Clarissa Vance watched from their throne-like chairs, their expressions unreadable, but their lack of intervention spoke volumes. "Margot, that's enough," a weak voice muttered. Harrison Vance, Sienna's father, stepped forward, but he wouldn't meet his daughter's eyes. He looked at the ground, his shoulders hunched. He was a man who had spent 20 years apologizing for existing in the shadow of his more successful siblings. "Is it Uncle Harrison?" Margot sneered, handing the empty decanter to a passing waiter without looking at him. "Sienna is an embarrassment to the family name. Look at her. She looks like she wandered in through the service entrance. In fact, Sienna, why don't you head back that way? The kitchen staff might have an apron you can borrow so you can actually be useful." A few of Margot's friends chuckled behind their hands. The humiliation was calculated, a public branding of Sienna's status within the dynasty. To the world, Sienna was the quiet relative, the one who lived in a modest apartment and worked a mid-level job, far removed from the private jets and offshore accounts that fueled the Vance lifestyle. Margot, draped in a $3,000 silk wrap that shimmered in the late afternoon sun, adjusted her diamonds with the casual confidence of someone who had never been told no. Sienna felt the weight of the phone in her clutch. It vibrated, a long, steady pulse. She knew who it was. Benedict Thorne didn't call unless the final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. "The service entrance," Sienna repeated quietly. Her voice was steady, a sharp contrast to the trembling hands of her father. She met Margot's arrogant gaze, her eyes tracking the way the other woman preened for the surrounding witnesses. "Yes," Margot snapped, her lip curling. "Move. You're ruining the aesthetic of the photos. And don't bother coming back for the toast. This party is for the people who actually contribute to the Vance legacy, not the ones who just leech off the reputation." Sienna looked at her father one last time. He stayed silent, his gaze fixed on the perfectly manicured grass. The betrayal stung more than the wine, but it was the final tether being cut. She didn't need his protection anymore. She didn't need any of them. "I'll leave," Sienna said. She turned, her heels clicking softly on the stone path. She didn't head toward the main house or the service entrance. She walked toward the long, winding driveway where the luxury cars were parked in a glittering row, their polished hoods reflecting the setting sun. As she reached the gate, she pulled her phone from her bag. The screen showed a missed call and a single message from Benedict Thorne. She felt a surge of cold, sharp adrenaline. "The audit is complete," the message read. "The Thorne Group has secured the majority stake in Vance Holdings. Everything, the house, the accounts, the name, it's all yours. Just say the word." Sienna stopped and looked back at the estate. From this distance, the party looked like a dollhouse, fragile and hollow. She could see Margot center stage, laughing and holding a fresh glass of champagne, oblivious to the fact that the very ground she stood on had just shifted. Margot thought she had just won a petty social war, never realizing she had just lost the entire kingdom. Sienna tapped the screen, her thumb hovering over the call button. Benedict picked up on the first ring. "I'm ready," Sienna said, her voice like ice. "Start the liquidation of Margot's personal trust. All of it. I want the freeze in effect by tomorrow morning." "Consider it done," Benedict replied, his tone professional yet carrying an edge of anticipation. And the estate. Sienna glanced at the wine stain on her dress. It was drying now, a dark, ugly mark of the family's contempt. Prepare the eviction notice. I want it delivered during the board meeting on Tuesday. If Margot loves the service entrance so much, she can use it to move her things out. She climbed into her modest sedan, the linen dress still damp against her back. She didn't mind the stain. It was the last thing the Vances would ever give her, and soon she would be taking everything else back. The countdown had begun. In 72 hours, Margot Vance wouldn't just be worried about the aesthetic of a photo. She'd be lucky if she was allowed through the front gate of the property she thought she owned. Sienna put the car in gear and drove away, leaving the sounds of the quartet and the shallow laughter behind her. The sleeping lion had finally woken up, and she was hungry for justice. The next morning, the smell of burnt coffee and old paper filled Sienna's small apartment. It was a far cry from the lavender-scented halls of the Vance estate, but she didn't mind the quiet. She sat at her kitchen table, her fingers tracing the embossed seal on a heavy manila envelope. Inside lay the truth Margot Vance was too arrogant to even suspect. Benedict Thorne sat across from her an hour later in a dimly lit corner of a quiet cafe. He was a man who dealt in certainties, his suit sharp and his eyes sharper. He didn't offer small talk, he offered results. The paperwork is finalized, Benedict said, sliding a tablet toward her. The holding company that owns the Vance primary residence and 40% of the textile firm, it's yours, effective midnight. Sienna looked at the digital signatures. Her pulse didn't quicken, it steadied. And the board meeting on Tuesday. Mayor Sterling will be there, as requested. He thinks it's a routine budget review. He has no idea he's about to witness a corporate execution. Benedict leaned back, his voice dropping an octave. Are you sure about this, Sienna? Once the eviction notice is served in front of the board, there's no going back. You'll be casting your father and sister into the street. They cast me out years ago, she replied, her voice like ice. They just let me keep a room in the house so they'd have someone to look down on. It's time they learned the cost of their view. 2 hours later, Sienna arrived at the Vance corporate headquarters. The lobby smelled of expensive lilies and polished mahogany, a scent designed to intimidate the unworthy. She needed her personal files from her old office, the one Margot had promised to reassign the night before. She found her sister in the hallway, surrounded by 3 junior associates. Margot looked radiant in a cream-colored silk suit, a sharp contrast to Sienna's off-the-rack navy blazer. The way Margot looked at her wasn't just dismissive, it was predatory. Oh, look, Margot said, her voice carrying across the marble floor. The charity case returns. I told the janitor to clear out that cubicle, Sienna. Your things are in the basement, next to the boiler. I figured you'd be used to the heat, considering how much time you spend in the kitchen. The associate snickered, a synchronized sound of corporate sycophancy. Harrison Vance stepped out of his corner office, his expression weary. He looked at Sienna, then at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. Margot, perhaps that was unnecessary, Harrison muttered weakly. Nonsense, Dad, Margot snapped, adjusting her diamond-encrusted watch. Space is for people who contribute. Sienna is just luggage, heavy, outdated luggage. She turned back to Sienna, her smile cold enough to crack the marble. Don't forget to use the service elevator on your way out. We wouldn't want you scuffing the main carpets before the mayor arrives on Tuesday. Sienna didn't flinch. She felt the weight of the digital recorder in her pocket, capturing every word of her sister's entitlement. She looked at her father, seeing the shell of the man who had once promised to protect her, now completely under Margot's thumb. I'll be sure to stay out of the way, Margot, Sienna said quietly. Until Tuesday. Margot laughed, a sharp, metallic sound that echoed off the glass walls. Tuesday? You think you're invited to the board meeting? You're not even a footnote anymore. You're a ghost, Sienna, and ghosts don't get a seat at the table. Sienna turned toward the service elevator. She wasn't going to the basement. She was going to the archives to pull the last piece of the puzzle. The original land grant Margot thought had been lost in the fire 10 years ago. As the elevator doors closed, Sienna checked her watch. 48 hours. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text to Benedict, proceed with the public filing. I want the news to hit the wires 10 minutes before she walks into that boardroom. The countdown was no longer in her head. It was on the clock. And Margot was about to find out that the luggage she'd tossed aside actually on the floor she was standing on. The board meeting wasn't just a budget review. It was the day the Vances would realize they were tenants in their own empire. 2 days later, the air in Benedict Thorne's private study smelled of aged parchment and the sharp, acidic tang of a fresh espresso. The morning light filtered through heavy velvet curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing over a mahogany desk cluttered with centuries of history. Sienna Vance sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the document resting between them. Benedict slid a heavy manila envelope across the polished wood. His hands, though aged, were steady. He looked at her with a mixture of professional admiration and a hint of warning. "It's all there, Sienna," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The original land grant from 1924, the maternal trust stipulations, and the certified deed. My team spent 48 hours in the county archives. Margot was so convinced the fire 10 years ago destroyed the paper trail that she never bothered to check the digital backups in the state capitol." Sienna reached out, her fingers brushing the thick, textured paper. The embossed gold seal of the county clerk felt cold and substantial under her touch. This was her weapon. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the foundation of the Vance empire, and it bore only one name as the rightful heir. Hers. "She thinks she's the queen of a castle built on sand," Sienna said quietly. The weight of years of dismissal felt lighter now, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the evidence in her hands. "The board meeting is in 24 hours, Benedict reminded her, leaning back. "The public filing will hit the wires 10 minutes before she takes the podium. Are you ready for the fallout? Harrison won't be able to protect you once Margot loses her mind." "Harrison has never protected me," Sienna replied, sliding the documents into her bag. "He's too busy trying to keep Margot from noticing he has no spine. I don't need a protector, Benedict. I need a witness." She left the office and drove toward the Vance estate. She had one final task, retrieving her mother's journals. She knew Margot would be there, preparing for the pre-board gala, and the thought of the confrontation didn't make her heart race. It made her focus. The estate appeared through the mist like a Gothic monument to ego. Sienna parked her modest sedan at the far end of the circular drive, a stark contrast to the fleet of silver European SUVs parked near the grand entrance. As she stepped into the foyer, the scent of Margot's cloying, expensive floral perfume hit her like a physical blow. Laughter erupted from the drawing room. Sienna walked toward the sound, her heels silent on the Persian rugs. She stopped at the threshold. Margot Vance was standing by the fireplace, a crystal glass of amber scotch in one hand, gesturing with an air of practiced royalty. Harrison Vance sat on the sofa, nursing a drink and looking at the floor as if searching for his lost dignity. "Oh, look," Margot sneered, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she spotted Sienna. "The ghost has returned to the scene of the crime. Come to beg for a seat at the dinner table, Sienna." Margot walked over, her silk dress rustling, a sound that usually signaled an impending insult. She didn't stop until she was inches from Sienna's face, the smell of scotch and vanity overpowering. "I'm here for my mother's journals," Sienna said, her voice a calm contrast to Margot's sharp edge. Margot laughed, a jagged sound that made Harrison flinch. "Those dusty old things. I had the house staff clear out that attic room yesterday. I believe they're currently sitting in the industrial shredder bin behind the garage. We're turning that space into a humidor for the board members. You know, for people who actually contribute to this family." The rage spike hit Sienna hard, a heat behind her eyes, but she didn't blink. She knew Margot was lying. The house staff were loyal to the memory of Sienna's mother, and they had already texted her that the boxes were safe in the gardener's shed. Margot was simply performing her favorite play, the destruction of Sienna. "You really enjoy it, don't you?" Sienna asked. "The cruelty, the way you treat this house like a trophy you won instead of a legacy you're supposed to guard." "I don't guard legacies, darling. I build them," Margot snapped, her eyes narrowing. She reached out and flicked a stray hair off Sienna's shoulder with a look of profound revulsion. "And you are nothing but a crack in the foundation. Harrison, tell your daughter that she's officially barred from the property as of 5 p.m. today. I won't have her depressing the guests at the gala." Harrison Vance looked up, his eyes weary and clouded with a cowardice that had become his permanent mask. "Sienna, just go." "It's easier this way. Margot has a lot on her plate with the merger." "The merger," Sienna repeated, a small, dangerous smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Yes, I imagine tomorrow will be a very big day for everyone." Margot stepped back, adjusting her diamond-encrusted watch. "It's the day the Vance name becomes global, and it's the day you finally realize that you are a footnote in a history book I'm rewriting. Now get out. You're tracking mud onto the marble." Sienna turned without a word. She felt the heavy envelope in her bag, a secret power that Margot couldn't even fathom. She walked back to her car, the sun dipping below the horizon and casting the estate into shadow. She pulled out her phone and sent a voice note to Benedict. "The gala tonight, I'm changing the plan. Don't wait for the board meeting. I want the mayor to see the deed tonight, right after Margot finishes her toast. Let's see how well she rewrites history when the ground starts to move." Sienna started the engine, her gaze fixed on the lighted windows of the drawing room. She could wait. She had waited years, but as she pulled away, she checked her watch. The countdown was no longer in days, it was in hours. And Margot Vance was about to find out that the ghost she had spent a decade trying to exorcise actually owned the house. 4 hours before the first guest was scheduled to arrive at the Vance estate, the air in the master dressing sweet-tasted of aerosol hairspray and expensive lilies. Sienna Vance sat perfectly still as a stylist adjusted the final pin in her hair. She wasn't looking at her reflection. She was staring at the small, velvet-lined clutch resting on her lap. Inside, the heavy weight of the original deed felt like a loaded weapon. The double doors swung open with a violent thud, and Margot Vance swept in, trailing the scent of a cloying, metallic perfume that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She was already draped in gold lame, her neck encrusted with diamonds that caught the light like shards of ice. She stopped behind Sienna, her eyes meeting her niece's in the mirror with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. "I thought I made it clear that you weren't to use the main stylists," Margot said, her voice dropping into that familiar, jagged register of entitlement. She reached out, her sharp, manicured nail flicking the silk strap of Sienna's midnight blue gown. "And this dress, it's far too elegant for a charity case. You're supposed to be a reminder of my generosity tonight, not a distraction. People might actually mistake you for someone who belongs here." Sienna didn't flinch. She felt the familiar heat of a rage spike tightening her chest, but she channeled it into a calm, steady breath. "I think the guests will see exactly who belongs here by the end of the night, Margot." Margot let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the marble walls. She leaned down, her face inches from Sienna's, the cold stones of her necklace pressing against Sienna's shoulder. "Your father's weakness must be genetic. You truly believe that a pretty dress and a bit of backbone will change the fact that you are a guest in my house. You are a ghost haunting a life that moved on a decade ago." "Houses have long memories," Sienna replied, her voice a low, dangerous silk. She turned her head slightly, meeting her aunt's gaze with a terrifyingly blank expression. "You should be careful, Margot. Sometimes the foundations shift when you least expect it. If I were you, I'd make sure my affairs were in order before the toast." Margot pulled back, her lip curling in a sneer. "Is that a threat from you? You don't even have a bank account I haven't authorized. You're a footnote, Sienna. A smudge on the Vance legacy that I am finally scrubbing away tonight." She turned to the stylist, her tone dismissive. "When you're finished with the help, come to my room. I need my train steamed again. The help can find her own way down the back stairs." As Margot marched out, Harrison Vance lingered in the doorway. He looked smaller than he had the day before, his tuxedo hanging off his narrow frame as if he were already shrinking under the weight of his wife's shadow. He looked at Sienna, his eyes darting to the door Margot had just exited, then back to his daughter. There was a flicker of something, regret perhaps, or a warning, but it was buried under years of cowardice. "Sienna," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Just don't make a scene tonight. Your aunt has worked very hard on this gala. Mayor Sterling is expecting a perfect evening. If you just stay quiet, maybe she'll reconsider the apartment in the city for you." Sienna looked at her father, feeling a cold, hollow pity. "I'm not looking for an apartment, Dad, and the mayor is going to get exactly what he expects, the truth." Harrison flinched as if she'd struck him. He opened his mouth to speak, but the sound of Margot's voice shrieking his name from down the hall sent him scurrying away like a frightened animal. Once the room was silent, Sienna pulled her phone from her clutch. She saw a message from Benedict Thorne. "The mayor has arrived early. He's in the library with the board members. The documents are verified and the digital copies are queued. All we need is the signal." Sienna stood up, the heavy silk of her gown rustling like a warning. She walked to the window, watching the line of black town cars beginning to snake up the long, winding driveway. The sun was setting, casting long, jagged shadows across the manicured lawn that Margot thought she owned. She touched the gold seal on the envelope inside her bag one last time. The countdown wasn't in hours anymore. It was in minutes. She could hear the faint strain of the string quartet beginning to play in the ballroom below. Margot was down there now, sipping champagne and basking in a glory built on theft. Sienna turned toward the door, her heels clicking against the marble with a rhythmic, predatory precision. She wasn't going down the back stairs. Tonight, she was taking the grand staircase, and she wasn't planning on ever coming back down. The evening of the Victory Gala arrived with a stifling humidity that even the estate's industrial-grade cooling system couldn't quite suppress. Within the grand ballroom of the Vance estate, the air was thick with the cloying scent of gardenias and the sharp, botanical sting of expensive gin. Crystal chandeliers vibrated with the low, rhythmic hum of a string quartet, their light fracturing against the polished marble floor like scattered diamonds. Margot Vance stood at the center of a semicircle of admirers, her laughter ringing out with the practiced, hollow clarity of a stage performer. She was draped in $40,000 of midnight blue silk that trailed behind her like a royal wake. She looked every bit the queen of the empire she had spent the last 3 years stealing. When a young server drifted too close with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, she didn't just decline. She reached out and adjusted the young woman's collar with a sharp, demeaning tug. "Presentation is everything, dear," she said, her voice carrying just enough to ensure the surrounding socialites heard. "If you can't manage a straight hem, perhaps you'd be better suited for the kitchens. Or the street." The server's face flushed a deep, humiliated crimson as she stammered an apology and scurried away. Margot didn't even watch her go. She simply took a fresh flute of champagne from a passing tray, her eyes already scanning the room for more significant prey. High above the floor, standing in the shadows of the mezzanine, Sienna Vance watched the display with a cold, detached precision. Her fingers traced the edge of the gold-sealed envelope tucked into her clutch, the paper stiff and unforgiving. She wasn't wearing the heavy silk Margot favored. Instead, she had chosen a tailored, floor-length gown in a shade of charcoal so dark it was nearly black. It was a garment designed not to draw the eye, but to command it once it arrived. "The digital feed is live," a low voice murmured beside her. Sienna didn't turn. She knew the scent of Benedict Thorne, sandalwood, and old books. He stood a respectful foot away, looking every bit the high-level consultant in his charcoal tuxedo. "The board members?" she asked, her voice a mere shadow of a sound. "Seated at the front tables exactly as Margot requested," Benedict replied. "They think they're here to witness her being named permanent chairperson. Harrison is with them. He looks unwell." Sienna glanced toward the VIP section. Her father, Harrison Vance, sat slumped in a gilded chair, his complexion the color of ash. He was nursing a drink with a trembling hand, his eyes darting toward Margot with a mixture of fear and pathetic longing. He was the man who had allowed his eldest daughter to be cast into the cold to satisfy the whims of his second wife's child. "He'll be fine," Sienna said, her voice devoid of pity. "He's had years to find his spine. Tonight, he can watch what happens when a structure is built on a rotten foundation." She began her descent. Her heels clicked against the marble steps with a slow, predatory rhythm that seemed to cut through the chatter of the room. As she reached the final tier, the crowd began to part, the sea of silk and wool yielding to her steady advance. Margot spotted her from across the room. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed, the predatory instinct of a bully sensing a change in the wind. She waited until Sienna was within earshot of the primary donors before she spoke. "Sienna, darling," Margot called out, her voice dripping with mock affection. "I was beginning to think you had another one of your episodes. You look so remarkably plain tonight. It's almost brave of you to show your face in such a state." A few of Margot's sycophants chuckled. Sienna stopped 3 feet away, her posture perfect, her expression an unreadable mask of calm. "I thought it best to leave the theatrics to you tonight, Margot," she replied. "After all, this is your big moment." Margot's lip curled. She stepped closer, the smell of her heavy, expensive perfume hitting Sienna like a physical blow. She leaned in, lowering her voice so only her sister could hear. "Enjoy your little front row seat to my coronation, you pathetic mouse. After tonight, I'm having the locks changed on the guest house. You've overstayed your welcome in my life." Sienna didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "You're right about one thing. Everything changes after tonight." The heavy double doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open, announcing the arrival of the evening's guest of honor. Mayor Sterling entered, flanked by 2 aides, his presence shifting the gravity of the room instantly. Margot's face transformed, the venom vanishing behind a mask of radiant, professional charm. She practically glided toward him, leaving Sienna standing alone in her wake. "Mayor Sterling, so wonderful of you to join us," Margot gushed, reaching for his hand. The mayor smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. He was a man who understood power, and more importantly, he understood who truly held it. "A significant night for the Vance legacy, I'm told." "The most significant," Margot replied, casting a dismissive glance back at Sienna. "We're finally trimming the dead weight and moving into a new era of leadership. I've prepared a few words to mark the occasion." She signaled to the tech booth at the back of the hall. The string quartet tapered off, replaced by a low, expectant silence. The lights in the ballroom dimmed, and a massive projection screen began to descend slowly from the ceiling behind the podium. Margot began to walk toward the stage, her chin tilted high, her silk gown whispering against the floor like a warning. She looked back once, her eyes finding Sienna's in the gloom. She mouthed a single word, "Goodbye." Sienna stood perfectly still as Margot ascended the steps. She felt the weight of the flash drive Benedict had handed her earlier, now resting in the palm of her hand. She caught Benedict's eye across the room. He was standing by the master control panel, his hand hovering over the override switch. Margot reached the podium and adjusted the microphone. The feedback ring echoed through the silent hall, sharp and jarring. She looked out over the sea of faces, the board members, the city's elite, the father who had failed to protect his own blood, and she smiled with the absolute certainty of a woman who thought she had already won. "Friends, colleagues, and family," Margot began, her voice amplified and booming. "Tonight, we don't just celebrate a company, we celebrate the triumph of vision over sentimentality." Sienna reached into her clutch and pulled out her phone. With a single, steady thumb press, she sent the final command. The projection screen behind Margot flickered to life, but it wasn't the corporate logo Margot expected. A grainy, high-definition video began to play, and the first sound to fill the ballroom wasn't Margot's voice, but the unmistakable recorded snarl of her own arrogance from a week prior. Margot froze, her hand still resting on the mahogany podium. The color didn't just leave her face. It seemed to evaporate, leaving her skin looking like translucent parchment. She turned slowly, her eyes widening as she saw her own image projected 20 feet high, her recorded voice echoing through the rafters. "I don't care about the legalities," the recorded Margot said on screen, her face twisted in a sneer. "By the time the board realizes the signatures are forged, the assets will be moved. Sienna is too stupid to even notice she's been erased." The silence that followed in the ballroom was absolute, a vacuum of shock that felt like it might collapse the walls. Every head in the room turned, not toward the screen, but toward the woman standing at the podium, whose empire was dissolving in the glow of her own digital ghost. Sienna took a single step forward into the light, her voice calm, clear, and utterly lethal. "Go on, Margot. I believe you had a few more words to say." Sienna's voice didn't tremble. It was a scalpel, thin and precise, slicing through the thick, suffocating silence of the ballroom. She didn't look like the stupid girl Margot had mocked for years. She looked like the only person in the room who knew exactly how the world worked. Margot's hand remained frozen in midair, her fingers still curled as if grasping for the power that had just evaporated into the rafters. That's a fabrication," she stammered, her voice thin and reedy, lacking its usual venomous bite. She turned to the crowd, her eyes wide and pleading. "It's a deepfake. AI. Sienna, how dare you use these cheap tricks to humiliate me in front of our guests?" "It's not a trick, Margot," Sienna said, her tone conversational, almost bored. She signaled to the back of the room. Benedict Thorne stepped out from the shadows of the velvet curtains, his expression as stoic as a cathedral. He wasn't carrying a drink or a party favor. He held a heavy, slate-gray leather folder. The smell of fresh ink and old wax seemed to follow him as he marched toward the podium. He didn't look at Margot. He walked straight to Mayor Sterling, who sat at the head table with a look of profound, frozen discomfort. "Mayor," Benedict said, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the hall. "As the Vance estate's legal counsel of record, I believe you should see the original filings. Not the ones Margot presented to the board last month, but the ones authenticated by the state controller this morning." Harrison Vance finally looked up from his lap, his face a mask of gray exhaustion. He reached out a hand as if to stop Benedict, but his fingers lacked the strength to even close. He looked at his eldest daughter, Margot, and then at Sienna. He chose to look away again, the ultimate cowardice of a man who had watched a theft and called it a business arrangement. Margot's features didn't just falter, they seemed to dissolve in the harsh glow of the overhead chandeliers. Her jaw hung slack, a jagged, silent O that made her look suddenly, pathetically aged, while the porcelain foundation she'd applied so carefully began to sheen with a cold, greasy sweat. Her eyes, usually sharp with calculated malice, now darted with the frantic, sightless rhythm of a cornered animal, and a dark, mottled flush crept up her throat to swallow the pale elegance she'd spent a lifetime cultivating. Her chest heaved, the silk of her designer gown straining as her breathing became a series of shallow, audible hitches. "This is impossible," she whispered, though the microphone caught it, broadcasting her collapse to every guest. Mayor Sterling adjusted his spectacles, his eyes scanning the documents Benedict had provided. The room held its breath. The only sound was the faint hum of the projector and the distant, rhythmic clinking of a silver spoon against a glass where a waiter had frozen in place. "This deed," the mayor began, his voice booming with the authority of a man who knew which way the wind was blowing. He looked at Margot with a cold, newfound distance. "It shows that the primary holdings of the Vance estate, including this very manor and the controlling interest in the firm, were transferred 6 months ago, not to Margot Vance." He turned his gaze to Sienna. "They were purchased in full by a private equity group headed by Sienna Vance." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom, a physical wave of shifting social alliances. Clarissa Vance, who had been laughing at Margot's jokes only an hour prior, visibly pulled her chair 3 inches away from Margot's side of the table. The board members, men who had signed Margot's forged documents with greedy smiles, suddenly found the patterns on the tablecloth intensely interesting. "You stole it," Margot hissed, her voice returning as a ragged snarl. She lunged toward the podium, her fingernails scratching against the mahogany. "You used Father's accounts. You're a thief." "I didn't steal anything, Margot," Sienna replied, stepping closer until she was inches from her sister's face. The scent of Margot's expensive, floral perfume was cloying, the smell of a wilting garden. "I bought the debt you created. I bought the mortgages you defaulted on while you were busy playing queen. I didn't erase you. You spent yourself into non-existence." Sienna reached out and calmly adjusted the microphone, her movements fluid and relaxed. She looked out at the room of witnesses, her eyes settling on Harrison, who still wouldn't meet her gaze, and then finally back to her sister. "You told everyone I didn't belong here," Sienna said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper that the speakers carried like a death sentence. "And you were right. I don't belong in a house built on lies, which is why I've already sold the property to the city for a public park. You have exactly 10 minutes to gather what's yours before the locks are changed." Sienna didn't wait for the scream she knew was coming. She didn't stay to watch the security team Benedict had waiting at the doors move in. She simply turned, her heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm against the marble floor, and walked out into the cool, honest night. The silence that followed the declaration was absolute, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the grand ballroom. For 3 heartbeats, the only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the foyer. Then, the vacuum shattered. Margot Vance didn't just scream. She let out a jagged, strangled sound that tore through the refined atmosphere like a serrated blade. She lunged toward the stage, her designer heels skidding on the polished marble. Her face didn't just pale, it seemed to lose its very structure. Her jaw hung slack, the heavy foundation she'd applied that morning settling into the fine lines around her mouth like cracked porcelain. Her eyes, usually sharp and predatory, darted wildly, the pupils blown wide with a primal, animalistic panic. The flush of wine and arrogance had been replaced by a sickly, grayish hue that made her look 20 years older in a matter of seconds. Her lips trembled, flecked with a bit of foam as she tried to form words that wouldn't come, her throat working in visible, frantic gulps. It was the look of a woman watching her entire identity dissolve into the air. "You're lying," she finally shrieked, her voice cracking. She turned to the crowd, her hands clawing at the air as if trying to grab hold of her evaporating status. "She's insane. She has no authority. Harrison, tell them she's lying." Harrison Vance didn't look up. He remained anchored to his chair, his shoulders slumped so low he looked like a man waiting for a blow he knew he deserved. He wouldn't even glance at the woman he had spent decades enabling. Benedict Thorne stepped forward from the shadows of the wings, his movements precise and professional. He didn't look at the shouting woman. His focus was entirely on the legal folder in his hands. He opened it, revealing the heavy, cream-colored pages of a deed, the gold city seal catching the overhead light with a predatory glint. "The sale was finalized at 4 o'clock this afternoon," Benedict said, his voice carrying the weight of an executioner's bell. "The transfer of title to the city's conservancy department is complete. The funds have already been moved into a restricted educational trust." "This is a circus," Margot turned, spotting a figure near the front. "Mayor Sterling, surely you aren't going to stand by while this girl plays games with private property." Mayor Sterling stepped into the light, his expression a mask of practiced, political neutrality that offered no warmth. He didn't move toward her. If anything, he shifted his weight back, creating a subtle but devastating distance. "I've seen the filings, Margot. The city council approved the acquisition of the Vance estate for the public park initiative during an emergency session 2 hours ago. The documentation is beyond reproach." The reaction from the room was instantaneous. Clarissa Vance, who had been Margot's most loyal sycophant for years, took a deliberate step backward, clutching her pearls as if Margot were suddenly contagious. Julian Vance, Margot's own cousin, didn't offer a hand. He simply checked his watch and whispered something to his wife about the valet. Across the room, the socialites who had laughed at Sienna's modest dress only an hour ago were now averting their eyes, their silence a collective, brutal shunning. Sienna stood at the microphone, her posture a stark contrast to the chaos below. She looked down at her sister, not with anger, but with a cold, clinical detachment. She reached into her small, unassuming clutch and pulled out a heavy ring of brass keys. The sound of them hitting the marble floor was like a gunshot. "Those are the keys to the side gate," Sienna said, her voice a lethal whisper that the speakers carried to every corner of the room. The main locks have already been cycled. Benedict's team is waiting in the driveway. They aren't there to protect your privacy, Margot. They're there to ensure the inventory matches the insurance riders. Margot scrambled for the keys, her fingers fumbling against the cold stone. You can't do this. This is my home. I am a Vance. You were a Vance, Sienna corrected, her tone as sharp as a winter frost. Now you're just a squatter on public land. You spent your inheritance on the illusion of power, but you forgot one thing. I was the one who kept the ledgers. The sound of heavy boots echoed from the foyer. The security team Benedict had promised. They stood in the arched doorway, their dark uniforms a grim contrast to the silk and sequins of the guests. The head of the team tapped his watch, looking directly at Margot. Sienna didn't wait for the inevitable breakdown. She didn't stay to watch the security guards escort her sister through the front doors she had once used to bar others. She turned to Harrison, who finally looked up, his eyes wet with a useless, belated regret. "Goodbye, father," she said softly, the words carrying no weight of forgiveness. "I hope the park is quiet enough for you to finally think." She walked off the stage, her heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm. She passed the mayor, past the whispering board members, and walked through the center of the ballroom. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, a path of forced respect clearing before her. She didn't look back as she stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the scent of stale lilies and dying ambition behind her. Behind her, the first sounds of the heavy front doors being barred echoed through the night. Sienna reached the end of the long, manicured driveway where a single, modest car was waiting. She didn't feel the triumph she had expected. She felt only a profound, hollow lightness. The weight of the Vance name was gone, scattered into the dark soil of a park that didn't exist yet. As the car pulled away, she caught one last glimpse of the house in the rearview mirror. The lights were flickering out, room by room, as the city took possession of its newest asset. In the shadows of the porch, a single figure stood alone, surrounded by the luggage she had managed to grab in 10 minutes. Sienna turned her gaze forward, toward the dark ribbon of the highway and the life she had finally bought for herself. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, handwritten note, the final piece of the puzzle she hadn't shared with anyone. Her thumb traced the ink, her eyes narrowing as she realized that while the house was gone, the secrets it held were only beginning to surface. The weeks following the Vance estate's seizure were a blur of legal filings and public scandal. Benedict Thorne had been surgical in his execution, ensuring that every legal loophole Margot Vance tried to crawl through was already welded shut. The city didn't just take the land, they took the legacy. Harrison Vance had vanished into a quiet, shameful retirement in a neighboring county, refusing to answer calls from either of his daughters. The grand ballroom where Sienna had been insulted was now a staging area for municipal architects. By the time the dust settled, the Vance name carried the scent of scandal rather than old money, a transformation so complete it felt as though the family had never truly existed at all. 6 months had passed since the gates of the Vance estate were locked for the final time. Sienna Vance sat in her new office on the 42nd floor, looking out over a city that felt smaller than it used to. The air in the room smelled of sandalwood and expensive paper, a far cry from the dust and mothballs of her childhood home. She traced the edge of a mahogany desk, her movements deliberate and calm. On the glass coffee table lay a local magazine with a headline she had avoided reading, From Dynasty to Dust, The Fall of the Vance Empire. A soft knock preceded Benedict Thorne. He looked exactly the same, though perhaps his smile was a bit more genuine now that he wasn't billing by the hour for a dying estate. He set a folder down on her desk, the heavy paper sliding with a satisfying hiss. "The final deeds are transferred to the trust," he said, leaning back against the window frame. "Mayor Sterling called this morning. He wanted to personally invite you to the ribbon cutting for the park next month. He's calling it the Clara Vance Memorial Green." Sienna looked at the rain streaking against the glass, blurring the city lights into glowing embers. "My mother would have liked that. She hated those manicured hedges anyway. She always wanted a place where the grass was allowed to grow wild. "And the rest of it?" Benedict asked, his voice softening. "The accounting is finished. You're officially the majority shareholder of the holding company. You have more wealth than Harrison and Margot ever dreamed of possessing." "It doesn't feel like wealth," she replied, her thumb tracing the small, handwritten note she still kept in her pocket. "It feels like a clean slate." Later that afternoon, Sienna found herself walking through the downtown shopping district. She didn't need anything, but she wanted to feel the pavement beneath her feet, to be a face in the crowd without the shadow of a name looming over her. She stopped in front of a high-end boutique, the kind of place where the sales clerks used to bow to Margot and ignore her. The sharp ding of the door's bell announced her arrival. The scent of expensive leather and floral perfume was thick enough to choke on. Sienna moved toward a rack of silk scarves, her fingers skimming the fabric. "I'll be with you in a moment," a voice snapped from the back of the store. It was a sharp, harried sound, vibrating with a familiar entitlement that had been hollowed out by exhaustion. Sienna turned slowly. Margot was standing by a display of designer handbags, her hands trembling as she tried to polish a smudge off a glass case. Her hair, once a perfect helmet of gold, was limp and pulled back into a messy knot. The designer suit she wore was a season old and showed signs of fraying at the cuffs. But it was her hands that told the real story. The expensive manicures were gone, replaced by short, jagged nails and a red rash from what looked like industrial cleaning fluid. Margot looked up, a practiced, fake smile plastered onto her face. It froze the moment she saw who was standing there. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a sallow, sickly gray. She dropped the polishing cloth, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "Sienna," she whispered, her voice cracking. Sienna didn't smile. She didn't need to. She simply looked at her sister, taking in the cheap polyester apron Margot was forced to wear over her old clothes. The Vance name tag pinned to her chest was the cruelest irony of all. It was the only thing she had left, and it was the very thing that made her unemployable anywhere else. "I heard the boutique was under new management," Sienna said, her voice echoing in the quiet store. "I didn't realize they had such a high turnover in staff." Margot's eyes darted to the security camera, then back to Sienna. Her arrogance tried to flare up, a dying ember in the dark. "This is temporary. Harrison is working on a deal. We'll have the house back by next year. You think you won, but you're still just." "Harrison isn't working on anything, Margot," Sienna interrupted, her tone flat. "He's in a 2-bedroom cottage in Oakhaven. He spends his days staring at a television that doesn't work. And you're folding clothes in a store you used to get kicked out of for being too loud." Margot flinched as if she'd been struck. She reached out to grab the counter for support, her knuckles white. "You did this. You ruined everything. We were a family." "We were a cage," Sienna corrected. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, gold-embossed card. She set it on the glass counter, right over the smudge Margot had been trying to clean. "If you ever decide to stop pretending, call Benedict. I've set up a small annuity. It's not much, just enough for a modest apartment and a bus pass, but it's more than you gave me." Margot stared at the card, her eyes filling with a bitter, hot rage. "I don't want your charity." "It's not charity," Sienna said, turning toward the door. "It's the cost of my conscience. I'd hate to think of a Vance sleeping on the street. It's bad for the brand." The bell chimed again as Sienna stepped out into the cool evening air. She didn't look back to see if Margot took the card. She knew she would. Arrogance was a luxury Margot could no longer afford. As Sienna walked toward her car, she felt the weight of the note in her pocket. It was the last thing her mother had written before the house took her spirit. "Don't let the walls define you," it read. Sienna looked up at the skyline. The Vance name was gone from the gates. The house was a memory, and her family was a collection of strangers. She had won everything, and in the process, she had lost the only people she was supposed to love. It was a fair trade, she decided, as she started the engine and drove toward a home that finally belonged to her.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.